The rain drummed against the corrugated roof like bullets on a tin shield, each drop echoing 47 years of buried secrets in the heart of America's forgotten towns. In places like Cedar Falls, Ohio, where factory smokestacks stand like tombstones against gray skies, the past doesn't die, it just waits, patient as a predator, for the right moment to claw its way back to the surface. They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when that blood has been spilled to build empires? When the powerful bury their sins so deep that entire families disappear into carefully crafted lies? When a single broken timing chain becomes the thread that unravels half a century of murder, corruption, and stolen innocence? Some mechanics fix engines, others fix lives. But when a luxury SUV rolls into a small-town garage on a rainy October afternoon, one man is about to discover that the most dangerous repair jobs are the ones that fix what powerful people never wanted found. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it, and some family reunions are worth killing for. The October rain drummed steadily against the corrugated roof of Thompson Auto Repair, creating a rhythmic symphony that had become the soundtrack to Bobby Thompson's 55 years of life. Each drop seemed to echo the countless hours he'd spent beneath the hoods of broken-down vehicles, his calloused hands working miracles on engines that others had given up for dead. The smell of motor oil and rust hung heavy in the humid air, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee from the pot that perpetually brewed in the corner of his cluttered office. Cedar Falls, Ohio, had seen better days. Once a thriving industrial town where factories hummed with the promise of the American dream, it now wore the weathered face of economic decline. Empty storefronts lined Main Street like missing teeth in an old man's smile, and the population had dwindled from its peak of 30,000 to barely 15,000 souls clinging to memories of prosperity. Bobby's shop sat at the intersection of Industrial Avenue and 3rd Street, a strategic location that had served 3 generations of Thompson men. His grandfather had opened the original garage in 1945, fresh from the Pacific Theater, with mechanical skills honed on B-17 bombers and a determination to build something lasting. His father, Michael Thompson, had expanded the business in the 1970s, adding a construction company that specialized in municipal projects and commercial buildings. Now, after Sarah's death 3 years ago, Bobby ran the shop alone, assisted only by his 17-year-old son Danny when school and football practice permitted. The construction company had died with Michael Thompson in 1976, taking with it the family's dreams of expansion and prosperity. What remained was honest work, fair prices, and a reputation for fixing vehicles that other shops had declared terminal. The gleaming Lexus LX 600 that rolled to a stop outside Bobby's bay doors looked as out of place in Cedar Falls as a diamond tiara in a coal mine. Its pristine white paint gleamed despite the overcast sky, and the distinctive lines of luxury spoke of a world where $60,000 vehicles were casual purchases rather than life-changing investments. Bobby wiped his hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades, squinting through the rain as the driver's door opened, with the soft thunk that only expensive German engineering could produce. The woman who emerged moved with the confident grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, her designer heels clicking against the wet asphalt with musical precision. She was perhaps 52, with auburn hair that caught the light despite the gloomy weather, styled in waves that spoke of expensive salons and professional maintenance. Her navy business suit was tailored to perfection, probably costing more than Bobby's monthly mortgage payment, and she carried herself with the poise of boardrooms and country clubs. Yet there was something about her face, something in the shape of her eyes and the way she tilted her head when thinking, that triggered a memory Bobby couldn't quite grasp. "Thompson Auto Repair?" she asked, her voice carrying the polished accent of someone who'd learned to speak in executive conferences and charity galas. "That's what the sign says," Bobby replied, not unkindly but without the automatic deference that wealth usually commanded in small-town Ohio. "What seems to be the trouble?" She gestured toward the Lexus with obvious frustration, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light. "It started making this horrible grinding noise about 20 miles back, just after I passed through Riverside." The dashboard looks like a Christmas tree, and I have a crucial board meeting in Columbus in 3 hours. Bobby approached the vehicle with the practiced eye of someone who'd diagnosed thousands of automotive ailments over 3 decades. The Lexus was maybe 2 years old, immaculate inside and out, the kind of vehicle that should purr like a contented cat. The leather interior still held that new car scent, and the odometer showed barely 12,000 miles. Mind if I take a listen? Bobby asked, and the woman she'd introduced herself as Victoria Sterling nodded permission. When Victoria turned the key, the engine produced a distinctly unhealthy knocking sound that made Bobby wince. It was the mechanical equivalent of a heart murmur, a rhythm that spoke of internal damage and expensive repairs. "You've got a serious problem with your timing chain," Bobby said after a few minutes of careful listening and preliminary examination. "Could be a stretched chain, a failed tensioner, or both. Either way, if you keep driving it like this, you'll be looking at a complete engine rebuild." Victoria's carefully composed facade cracked slightly, revealing a vulnerability that seemed at odds with her polished exterior. "How long to fix it?" "Day and a half, maybe 2, Bobby said honestly, knowing the estimate wouldn't be welcome news. "This isn't the kind of repair you rush, especially on a vehicle like this. I'll need to order parts from Columbus, and the labor is intricate work." For a moment, Victoria Sterling looked less like a powerful CEO and more like any other customer facing an expensive, inconvenient reality. Bobby found himself studying her face more closely, searching for the source of that nagging familiarity. There was something about her features, the delicate bone structure, the way her eyebrows arched when she was thinking, the small freckle just above her left eyebrow that tugged at memories buried so deep he'd almost forgotten they existed. "Is there somewhere I can wait while you look at it more thoroughly?" she asked, pulling a phone from an expensive leather handbag. Bobby gestured toward the small office attached to the shop, a cramped space that served as command center for his one-man operation. "You can use the phone to call a car service if you need to. Coffee's fresh if you want some, though I can't promise it meets country club standards." Victoria smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her, and for a fleeting moment, Bobby glimpsed something beneath the executive armor. "I'm sure it's fine. Mr. Thompson, I wasn't always accustomed to country clubs." As Victoria made her calls, Bobby popped the hood and began his detailed examination. The timing chain issue was obvious to his trained eye, but he also noticed other signs that told a story. Premium maintenance records tucked neatly in the glove compartment showed every service performed right on schedule at a high-end dealership in Columbus. This wasn't a neglected vehicle or an owner who cut corners on maintenance. Sometimes expensive cars just broke in expensive ways, like thoroughbred horses that required more care than draft animals. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson called about her Buick," a voice called from the office doorway. Danny Thompson, 17 years old and built like the linebacker he was, leaned against the frame with the easy confidence of youth. His dark hair was tousled from football practice, and despite growing up in the shop, he'd somehow inherited his mother's gentle eyes and infectious smile. The boy had Sarah's heart and Bobby's hands, equally comfortable discussing literature as he was rebuilding transmissions. "Tell her Thursday morning," Bobby replied, sliding out from under the Lexus to grab his diagnostic equipment. "And don't forget you've got that college application essay due tomorrow." Danny grinned, the expression lighting up his face. "Already finished. Why I want to study engineering at Ohio State. Professor Martinez helped me edit it during study hall. You want to read it?" "Later. Right now, help me run diagnostics on this beauty. Might be educational. You don't see many vehicles like this in Cedar Falls." As father and son worked together with the seamless efficiency born of years of partnership, Victoria emerged from the office. She'd removed her jacket, revealing a silk blouse that probably cost more than most of Bobby's customers spent on their entire wardrobes. But she watched their work with obvious interest rather than impatience. "My assistant is arranging a car," she announced. "It should be here in 30 minutes. She paused, observing the easy interaction between Bobby and Danny. "You run this place alone?" "Just me and Danny when he's not at school or practice," Bobby replied, connecting the diagnostic computer to the Lexus's onboard systems. My wife Sarah passed 3 years ago. Heart condition, she was born with a defect that finally caught up with her. I'm sorry, Victoria said, and Bobby was surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. There was no platitude or social nicety in her tone, just honest, human compassion. Losing someone you love changes everything, doesn't it? Before Bobby could respond, Danny looked up from the diagnostic readout he was studying. Mom always said Dad could fix anything except broken hearts, but he's gotten pretty good at fixing those too, over time. An unexpected silence fell over the group. Victoria's expression softened in a way that transformed her face, making her look younger and more vulnerable than the polished executive who'd first stepped out of the Lexus. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that Bobby couldn't quite identify. She was, Bobby agreed, checking the diagnostic results Danny had pulled up. Taught Danny here that there's no shame in honest work, no matter what anyone else might think. Sarah was a nurse at the county hospital for 20 years before her own condition forced her to retire. She understood the value of helping people, whether it was healing bodies or fixing cars. Victoria nodded slowly, as if processing something deeper than the casual conversation. That's a valuable lesson. I sometimes wonder if I learned it early enough in life. A sleek black Tesla pulled into the lot, its silent approach almost ghostly compared to the rumbling engines Bobby was accustomed to. Victoria gathered her things and preparing to leave, but something made her pause. Mr. Thompson, she said, what you do here fixing things that others might give up on, it's important work. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As she walked toward the waiting Tesla, Bobby noticed her stop by the shop's faded wooden sign. The painted letters reading, Thompson Auto Repair, serving Cedar Falls since 1945, had weathered decades of Ohio seasons. But they remained clearly visible. Victoria studied the sign for a long moment, her expression unreadable, as if the words meant something more to her than simple business identification. She seemed nice, Danny observed as they watched the Tesla disappear into traffic. Different from your usual customers. She didn't act like her money made her better than us. Bobby nodded distractedly, his mind already cataloging the repairs the Lexus would need. But something nagged at him, that persistent sense of familiarity, the way Victoria had looked at their family name on the shop sign, as if it triggered some deeply buried memory. The rest of the day passed in the familiar rhythm of small-town auto repair work. Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick needed new brake pads and a stern lecture about the importance of regular maintenance. Jimmy Rodriguez brought in his pickup truck with a mysterious electrical problem that turned out to be a corroded ground wire. The Hendersons' minivan required an oil change and a promise that, yes, it would survive another year of hauling kids to soccer practice. By closing time, Bobby had compiled a comprehensive estimate for Victoria's Lexus, $40, $800 in parts and labor. The kind of bill that would send most of his regular customers into financial therapy. The timing chain replacement was intricate work, requiring the removal of several engine components and precise reassembly with specialized tools. That evening, as Bobby and Danny shared a dinner of homemade chili and cornbread at their modest kitchen table, they reviewed college application materials and discussed Danny's future. The boy had inherited his mother's academic gifts along with his father's mechanical aptitude, earning a full scholarship to Ohio State's engineering program. Dad, you're not listening, Danny said, waving a hand in front of Bobby's face. I asked if you wanted to read my essay about why I want to study mechanical engineering. Sorry, son. Long day. Bobby took the printed pages Danny offered, but his mind kept drifting to Victoria Sterling. Danny, did that woman, Ms. Sterling, remind you of anyone? Danny considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all conversations. Despite his youth, he'd developed the thoughtful nature that came from losing his mother at a formative age and taking on responsibilities beyond his years. Not really. Why she seemed familiar to you? Bobby shrugged, unwilling to voice suspicions that might be nothing more than imagination. Just something about her. I guess, probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and Bobby knew it. That night, after Danny had gone to bed to finish homework and prepare for tomorrow's chemistry test, Bobby found himself in the garage where boxes of family belongings had sat largely untouched since Sarah's death. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he found it, a small cardboard box labeled Family Photos and Documents in Sarah's careful handwriting. Sarah had been the family archivist, the one who preserved memories and maintained connections to the past. After her death, Bobby had boxed up her carefully organized photo albums and genealogy research, unable to face the memories they contained, but unwilling to discard them. Inside the box, beneath layers of old tax returns and insurance papers, Bobby discovered documents he'd forgotten existed. His parents' life insurance policies, paid out after the house fire that had claimed them when Bobby was 8 years old. The final police report on the fire, marked Case Closed, Accidental Cause. A small collection of condolence cards from neighbors and family friends, expressions of sympathy that had meant little to an 8-year-old boy whose world had just collapsed. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age, a small collection of photographs that had survived the fire because they'd been in Bobby's school backpack that terrible October night in 1976. One photograph in particular caught his attention and made his breath catch in his throat. It showed his family on Christmas morning, probably taken just weeks before the fire that would destroy everything. His father, Michael Thompson, grinned beside a bicycle he'd assembled on Christmas Eve, his carpenter's hands still bearing the small cuts and calluses that marked his trade. His mother, Ruth, held 5-year-old Catherine on her lap, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. And 8-year-old Bobby stood proudly beside his little sister, his arm around her shoulders in the protective gesture that had defined their relationship. Catherine, his little sister, with her auburn hair catching the Christmas tree lights and her bright eyes sparkling with the joy of childhood. The same eyes that had looked back at him from Victoria Sterling's face that afternoon. Bobby's hands trembled as he studied the photograph under the garage's fluorescent light. Catherine had died in the fire. The authorities had been certain. They'd found her body in her bedroom, identified through dental records that Bobby had been too young to understand. He'd attended her funeral 3 days after his 8th birthday, placing a small bouquet of daisies on a tiny white casket that seemed impossibly small to contain all the love and laughter that had been his sister. But looking at the photograph now, then remembering Victoria Sterling's face, the resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the eyes, the delicate arch of the eyebrows, the way she tilted her head when thinking. Even the small scar on her left wrist that Bobby had noticed when she'd handed him her keys, a scar that perfectly matched one Catherine had gotten falling off her bike just months before the fire. Bobby sat back on his heels, surrounded by the detritus of a life he'd thought he understood, his mind reeling with possibilities that seemed to defy logic. It wasn't possible. Catherine had died 47 years ago. He'd grieved for her with the devastating completeness that only children can experience, had nightmares for years about not being able to save her from the flames that had consumed their family home. The idea that she might somehow be alive, that she might have walked into his shop that very afternoon, driving a luxury SUV and wearing designer clothes, was beyond comprehension. Yet the evidence was there in the photograph, in the memories that were suddenly crystal clear, in the instinctive recognition he'd felt but couldn't place. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start looking. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent October rain that seemed to seep into everything: clothing, buildings, souls. Bobby had slept fitfully, his dreams filled with memories of the night that had changed everything. The smell of smoke creeping under his bedroom door, the sound of sirens growing closer, the terrible realization that the people he loved most in the world were gone, and he was alone. Danny noticed his father's distraction immediately as they shared breakfast and prepared for their respective days. "Dad, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" "Just thinking about an old case," Bobby replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. The Thompson fire had been a case, officially closed but never truly resolved in his mind. Hey, do me a favor and handle the morning customers. I need to make a trip to the courthouse. Danny raised an eyebrow but nodded. At 17, he learned to trust his father's instincts and ask questions only when answers were truly necessary. Want me to call Ms. Sterling about her car? You said the parts would be in this morning. Yeah, call her. Tell her we should have everything ready by this afternoon. Bobby hesitated and then added, and Danny, be friendly. But if she seems interested in family history or asks personal questions, just stick to talking about the car. Okay, Danny said slowly, clearly puzzled by the unusual instruction. Dad, is there something I should know about Ms. Sterling? Bobby looked at his son so young, so trusting, so blissfully unaware that their simple life was about to be turned upside down. Maybe. I'll know more after I visit the courthouse. The Fairfield County Courthouse was an imposing brick building that had overseen the legal affairs of Cedar Falls for over a century. Its neoclassical facade spoke of permanence and justice, though Bobby had learned over the years that both concepts were more fragile than the architects had intended. He hadn't been inside since Sarah's estate had been settled, and the familiar smell of old wood and bureaucracy brought back uncomfortable memories of legal proceedings and official condolences. The records office was staffed by Mrs. Patterson, no relation to the Mrs. Patterson, who owned the ancient Buick, a woman who'd been there since Bobby was a child and who seemed to know every secret the county had ever recorded. She'd aged gracefully into her 70s, her silver hair always perfectly arranged and her manner combining efficiency with genuine warmth. Bobby Thompson, she said with a smile that reached her eyes. What brings you here? Everything all right with Danny. I heard he got into Ohio State. Danny's fine, Mrs. Patterson. Full scholarship to study engineering. Bobby couldn't help but smile when talking about his son's accomplishments. I'm actually looking for some old records about the fire that killed my parents back in '76. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew sympathetic, and she lowered her voice in the respectful way people did when discussing long-ago tragedies. Oh, honey, that was such a terrible thing. What kind of records are you looking for? Is this for some kind of memorial or anniversary piece? The investigation file, property transfer records, anything related to what happened after, Bobby said carefully. And I'd like to see the coroner's report, if possible. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. Requests for decades-old death records weren't uncommon, but they usually came from genealogists or insurance investigators, not from surviving family members who'd lived with the tragedy for nearly half a century. Of course, dear, it might take me a while to locate everything. Some of those older files have been moved to the basement archives. Why don't you have a seat, and I'll see what I can find. It took Mrs. Patterson nearly an hour to locate the relevant files, and Bobby spent the time studying the courthouse's memorial wall, where the names of county residents who died in various wars were inscribed in brass letters. His grandfather's name was there, along with dozens of other young men who'd never made it home from foreign battlefields. The Thompson family had always believed in service, in doing what was right even when it was difficult. When Mrs. Patterson finally returned with a thick manila folder, Bobby's heart was racing with anticipation and dread. This is everything we have on file, she said, settling the folder on the counter with obvious care. You can look through it here, but some of these documents might be difficult to read. Are you sure you want to do this alone? Bobby nodded, though he appreciated her concern. I need to understand what happened. He opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Despite his attempts at composure, the police report was on top, its pages yellowed with age and brittle from decades in storage. He'd seen portions of it before, during the insurance investigation that had followed the fire, but had never read it thoroughly. Now, as an adult with 47 years of perspective and a lifetime of experience reading technical documents, details jumped out that he'd never noticed as a grieving child. The fire had started in the basement, apparently from faulty electrical wiring near the furnace. But the electrical system had been inspected and updated just 6 months earlier by Thompson Construction, his father's company. The same company that had been involved in several major municipal projects that year. including the new city hall and courthouse annex. Bobby flipped through witness statements, firefighter reports, and photographs that made his stomach clench with remembered grief. Then he found something that made his blood run cold and his hands shake with more than sorrow. A property transfer document dated 3 weeks after the fire. The lot where the Thompson family home had stood, the lot where his parents and sister had supposedly died, had been sold to Sterling Development Corporation for $75,000. In 1976, that was serious money for a piece of residential land in Cedar Falls, especially land that now carried the stigma of tragedy. Sterling Development Corporation. Victoria Sterling. Bobby's mind raced as he continued reading. Sterling Development had purchased not just the Thompson lot, but 3 adjacent properties, all within 6 months of the fire. The company had demolished everything and built a small office complex that still stood today, housing a tax preparation service and a dental practice. "Mrs. Patterson," Bobby called, his voice tight with forced control. "Do you have any records on Sterling Development Corporation, corporate filings, business licenses, anything like that?" She looked up from her computer terminal, clearly concerned by the change in his demeanor. "Let me check our business registry. That might take a few more minutes." While she searched, Bobby continued through the fire investigation file. The coroner's report was clinical in its detail, describing 3 victims found in the burned remains of the Thompson home. Michael Thompson, age 34, found near the basement stairs. Ruth Thompson, age 31, found in the master bedroom. Catherine Thompson, age 5, found in her bedroom. But as Bobby read more carefully, inconsistencies began to emerge. The body identified as Catherine had been so badly burned that identification had been based primarily on location and circumstantial evidence. The dental records match had been probable rather than definitive. And there had been some confusion about the timeline. The fire department's initial sweep had found only 2 bodies, with the third discovered during a more thorough search the following day. Mrs. Patterson returned with another folder. "Here's what we have on Sterling Development. They were pretty active in the late 70s and early 80s. Then the company was dissolved in 1995. Bobby opened the folder with growing dread and found exactly what he'd feared. Sterling Development Corporation had been founded in 1975 by Judge Eleanor Sterling and her son, Marcus Webb Sterling. Eleanor Sterling. Bobby recognized the name immediately. She'd been a county judge for over 20 years before retiring to her estate outside Columbus. A woman known for her charitable work and community leadership. And there, listed as a dependent on Marcus Sterling's 1978 tax return, was Catherine Sterling, adopted daughter, age 7, date of birth, March 15, 1971, the same birthday as Catherine Thompson. The room seemed to spin around Bobby as the implications hit him like a physical blow. Catherine hadn't died in the fire. Somehow, she'd been rescued and adopted by the Sterling family, the same family whose development company had purchased the land where his family had supposedly died. But if Catherine had survived, why had the authorities identified a body as hers? And why had the Sterling family never revealed that they'd rescued her from the fire? Bobby's phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was Danny. "Dad, Ms. Sterling called. She wants to pick up her car this afternoon around 3. I told her it would be ready. Also, she asked some weird questions." "What kind of questions?" Bobby asked, his heart racing. "About our family history, how long we've been in Cedar Falls, whether we'd always lived on Maple Street, stuff like that. I thought it was just small talk, but it seemed like she was really interested in the answers." Bobby closed his eyes, trying to process this new information. "What did you tell her?" "Just basic stuff. That you grew up here, that Grandpa and Grandma died when you were little, that we've been running the shop for generations." "Was that okay?" "That's fine, son. I'll be back soon. Just keep everything normal." "Okay." "Sure, Dad. You sound weird, though. You sure you're all right?" "I'm fine." Bobby lied. "See you soon." Bobby spent the next 2 hours in the courthouse archives, piecing together a timeline that made his blood run cold with each new discovery. The fire had indeed been ruled accidental, but there were inconsistencies in the investigation that seemed to have been glossed over or ignored entirely. His father's construction company had been working on several major municipal projects in 1976, including the new courthouse annex in City Hall. Bobby found records indicating that Michael Thompson had discovered irregularities in the building contracts, substandard materials being billed at premium prices, safety inspections that had been falsified, municipal officials who seemed to be turning a blind eye to obvious problems. More disturbing still, Michael Thompson had been scheduled to testify before the county commission about these irregularities the Tuesday after he died. His testimony would have exposed a corruption scheme involving millions of dollars in some of Cedar Falls' most prominent citizens. Among the names mentioned in his father's notes were Judge Eleanor Sterling and Marcus Webb Sterling, both of whom served on the Municipal Building Commission that had approved the questionable contracts. Bobby drove back to the shop in a daze, his mind reeling with possibilities that seemed to grow more sinister with each mile. If his suspicions were correct, his family hadn't died in an accidental fire. They'd been murdered to prevent his father from exposing a corruption scandal that would have destroyed careers and sent powerful people to prison. And somehow, his sister Catherine had survived, been rescued or taken by the Sterling family, and raised as their own daughter under a new identity, probably unaware of her true origins and the circumstances that had brought her into their world. The woman who'd walked into his shop yesterday wasn't just a random customer with a broken-down luxury SUV. She was his sister, Catherine Thompson, now Victoria Sterling, the unknowing beneficiary of blood money and the unwitting heir to a legacy built on murder and deception. Bobby pulled into the shop's parking lot just as a familiar black Tesla was arriving. Victoria Sterling stepped out, looking as polished and composed as she had the day before. But now Bobby saw different details, the way she walked with a slight favoring of her left foot, the result of a childhood injury he remembered clearly. The unconscious habit of tucking her hair behind her right ear when thinking, exactly as Catherine had done. The way she held her head when listening carefully, tilted slightly to one side. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted him with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you have good news about my car." "Repairs are done," Bobby said carefully, studying her face for any sign of recognition or awareness. "But before we settle up, I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." Victoria's smile faltered slightly, and Bobby caught a flash of something in her expression, uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of suspicion. "What kind of questions?" Bobby gestured toward the office, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Maybe we could talk privately." Inside the small office, surrounded by decades of automotive memories and family photographs that took on new significance in light of what he'd discovered, Bobby struggled with how to begin. How did you tell someone that their entire life was based on a lie, that the family they'd known and loved might have been built on murder and deception? "Miss Sterling," he began carefully, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "How long have you been part of the Sterling family?" Victoria's professional demeanor shifted noticeably toward caution, and Bobby saw intelligence and wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there during their previous interactions. "I'm not sure why that's relevant to automotive repair, Mr. Thompson." Bobby reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph he'd found the night before, the Christmas morning picture showing his family in happier times, including 5-year-old Catherine with her bright smile and dancing eyes. He placed it on the desk between them with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. "Because I think you're my sister." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Victoria stared at the photograph, her face draining of color as recognition dawned in stages. Her hands trembled as she picked up the picture, examining it with the intensity of someone seeing their own face in a mirror for the first time. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I've always been Victoria Sterling." "Your name was Catherine Thompson," Bobby said gently, fighting back 47 years of grief and hope and desperate longing. You were 5 years old when our parents died in a house fire. I was 8. I thought you died too, until I saw you yesterday and recognized something I couldn't quite place. Victoria set the photograph down with shaking hands, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. You're wrong. You have to be wrong. I remember my childhood. I remember my parents, Judge Eleanor Sterling, my father Marcus. I remember growing up in Columbus, going to Wellington Academy, spending summers at the family estate. What's your earliest memory? Bobby asked quietly, leaning forward with the intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the answer. Victoria opened her mouth to respond immediately, then closed it. She was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration as she searched through decades of memories that Bobby suspected might not be as clear as she'd thought. She paused, confusion evident in her voice. When I was 7, I think, starting school at Wellington Academy, but everyone said I'd been sick before that. That's why my memories were fuzzy. They said I'd had a traumatic fever that affected my memory. Bobby's heart broke for the little girl who'd been told lies to explain away the gaps in her past. Victoria, look at your left wrist. Without thinking, Victoria pushed up her sleeve, revealing a small, crescent-shaped scar that Bobby had noticed the day before. He pulled up his own sleeve, showing an identical mark in exactly the same location. We got those the same day, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. You fell off your bike trying to keep up with me when I was racing to Jimmy Martinez's house. You were crying, and I felt so guilty for going too fast that I crashed my bike on purpose so you wouldn't feel bad. Mom took us both to the emergency room. You needed 3 stitches. I needed 4. Mom bought us ice cream afterward and made us promise to be more careful. Victoria stared at the matching scars, her eyes filling with tears as fragments of memory began to surface like bubbles, rising from the depths of a dark pond. I remember ice cream, she whispered, strawberry ice cream, and someone with kind hands who smelled like sawdust. Dad was a carpenter, Bobby confirmed, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He always smelled like sawdust and honest work. Before Victoria could respond, the office door burst open with explosive force. A tall, imposing man in an expensive suit strode in, his face dark with anger and something that looked dangerously close to panic. Bobby recognized him immediately from the courthouse photographs, Marcus Webb Sterling, now in his 70s but still radiating the authority and menace that had once made him one of Ohio's most feared attorneys. Victoria, we need to go. Now. His voice carried the kind of command that expected immediate obedience. Bobby stood as well, positioning himself between Marcus and Victoria with protective instincts that had been dormant for 47 years. This is a private conversation. Marcus's cold eyes fixed on Bobby with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. I know exactly what kind of conversation this is, Mr. Thompson, and it ends now. Victoria rose unsteadily to her feet, looking between the two men with growing confusion and dawning horror. Marcus, this is Mr. Thompson. He's been telling me the most extraordinary story about— I know exactly what he's been telling you. Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp with authority and something that sounded like desperation. And it's all lies designed to extort money from our family? Bobby stepped closer to Marcus, no longer intimidated by wealth or position or legal threats. The only lies here are the ones your family has been telling for 47 years. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the cold calculation of someone who'd spent decades destroying opposition and eliminating threats. Mr. Thompson, you're playing a very dangerous game. Victoria's my adopted sister, raised by my mother after her parents died in a tragic accident. Any resemblance to your deceased family members is purely coincidental. Then explain the scar, Bobby challenged, his voice growing stronger with each word. Explain why Sterling Development bought our family's property 3 weeks after the fire. Explain why my father was scheduled to testify about municipal corruption involving your company the week after he died. Marcus's composure cracked slightly, and Bobby caught a glimpse of the man behind the lawyer's mask, someone capable of violence. someone who'd made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that Catherine Thompson didn't die in that fire, Bobby said firmly, his voice carrying across the small office like a declaration of war. I know that somehow your family got her out of there, gave her a new identity, and raised her as Victoria Sterling. What I don't know yet is whether you saved her life or whether you took her after murdering our parents. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if the words had struck her physically. Marcus, is he telling the truth? Am I adopted? Is my real name Catherine Thompson? The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of hidden truth and carefully constructed lies. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quieter, but no less menacing. Yes, he said simply. You're adopted, but not in the way he's suggesting. My mother rescued you from that fire. She saved your life when everyone else had given up. And our parents, Bobby pressed, moving closer to his sister with protective instincts that felt as natural as breathing. Did your family save them too? Marcus's expression hardened into something that belonged in a courtroom where verdicts meant the difference between freedom and prison. Your parents died in an accidental fire caused by faulty wiring. The subsequent investigation and property acquisition were handled according to legal procedures. Any suggestion of wrongdoing is slanderous and actionable. Bobby pulled out his phone, displaying a photograph he'd taken at the courthouse. This is a memo from your law firm to Sterling Development, dated 2 days before the fire. It details strategies for acquiring the Thompson property and minimizing complications from scheduled municipal testimony. Marcus's face went pale as he realized that 47 years of careful cover-up were unraveling in front of him. You're recording this conversation illegally. Ohio is a one-party consent state, Bobby replied with the calm of someone who'd done his homework. And you just admitted to advanced knowledge of plans to acquire our property before the fire that supposedly randomly killed my parents. Victoria suddenly stood up, her face a mask of barely controlled emotion and dawning horror. I need air. I need to think. I need to get away from both of you. She pushed past Marcus and headed for the door, but Bobby caught her arm gently. Catherine, please. I know this is overwhelming, but don't call me that, she snapped, jerking away from his touch. I don't know who I am anymore, but I know I can't trust either of you. She fled the office, leaving Bobby and Marcus facing each other like gunfighters in an old Western movie. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice to the kind of whisper that carried more threat than shouting. You have no idea what you started, he hissed. My family has protected Victoria for 47 years. We've given her everything: education, opportunities, a life of privilege she never would have had growing up in this place. You want to destroy all that for some misguided sense of justice. Bobby met his gaze without flinching. I want to know why my parents died. I want to know why my sister was stolen from me. And I want to know why your family has been living off blood money for half a century. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. You're making a serious mistake. Thompson, there are things about that night you don't understand. Things that could hurt a lot of innocent people if they come to light. Are you threatening me? Bobby asked, his voice deadly quiet. I'm warning you, Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving Bobby's face. Walk away now. Take your son and leave town for a few weeks. Let this blow over. When you come back, you'll find that your shop has received some very generous anonymous donations. Your son's college fund will be fully endowed. Everyone wins. And if I don't walk away, Marcus's smile was as cold as winter in Ohio. Then you might discover that Cedar Falls is a more dangerous place than you realized. Before Bobby could respond, Marcus strode out of the office, leaving Bobby alone with the weight of 47 years of deception and the terrifying realization that his family's murder might be just the beginning of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Ohio's legal and political establishment. Outside, Bobby found Victoria sitting on the hood of her Lexus, staring into the distance with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose entire reality had just been shattered. She'd removed her jacket, and in the afternoon light, Bobby could see more clearly the way she resembled the little girl he'd lost so long ago. "I remember," she said quietly as Bobby approached, her voice barely audible above the traffic noise from the nearby highway. "Not everything, but pieces. Fragments that I always thought were dreams or childhood fantasies." Bobby moved slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "What do you remember? A room with dinosaur wallpaper? A man with gentle hands who smelled like sawdust and coffee? A woman who sang lullabies about mockingbirds and diamond rings?" Her voice broke slightly. "And you, I remember you reading me stories about wild things and brave little girls." Bobby's throat tightened with emotion so powerful it was almost physical pain. "You loved Where the Wild Things Are. I must have read it to you 100 times. You insisted on acting out all the parts." Victoria looked at him with eyes that held 47 years of questions and the dawning recognition of a truth that changed everything. "Why would they lie to me, Bobby? Why would they take me from you and make me forget who I was?" "I don't know yet," Bobby admitted, his voice rough with emotion and determination. "But I'm going to find out." A new voice interrupted them, older and weathered, but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Maybe I can help with that." "Sure." They turned to see an elderly man approaching from a battered pickup truck parked across the street. He was tall and lean, with weathered features and the careful posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching and waiting. His eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd seen too much and forgotten too little. "Frank Morrison," he introduced himself, extending a hand to Bobby. "Retired detective, Cedar Falls Police Department. I worked the Thompson fire case back in '76. Bobby shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that spoke of old-school police work. "What brings you here, Detective Morrison?" "Been following Marcus Webb's movements for the past few days," Frank replied grimly, his eyes never leaving their faces. When a man starts making the kind of phone calls he's been making, reaching out to certain people, it usually means someone's getting close to something he wants to keep buried. Victoria slid down from the car hood, her business executive demeanor reasserting itself despite her emotional turmoil. What kind of phone calls? Frank looked at her with sympathetic eyes that had seen too many victims and not enough justice. The kind that end with people having accidents. Ms. Sterling, or should I say, Ms. Thompson. Bobby felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Are you saying we're in danger?" "I'm saying that 47 years ago, I was a young detective who asked too many questions about a fire that didn't add up," Frank explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades of frustration and regret. "The official investigation concluded it was an accident, but there were inconsistencies that bothered me. When I kept pushing for answers, I found myself transferred to traffic duty for the rest of my career." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Victoria asked, her business training overriding her emotional confusion as she focused on facts and evidence. Frank pulled a manila envelope from his truck, his movements deliberate and careful. Copies of evidence that mysteriously disappeared from the official file, witness statements that were never included in the report, and this, he handed them a photograph that made Bobby's world tilt sideways. It showed a young woman holding a small child, but the setting was unfamiliar, not the Sterling estate, but what looked like a modest apartment with generic furniture and institutional lighting. "That was taken 6 months after the fire," Frank explained, "by a social worker who was monitoring Catherine's placement with the Sterling family. She kept her own records, separate from the official files." Bobby studied the photograph with growing confusion and horror. Victoria Catherine looked traumatized, clinging to an older woman who definitely wasn't Judge Eleanor Sterling. The child in the picture bore little resemblance to the confident, polished woman standing beside him now. "Who is that with her?" Bobby asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would only deepen the mystery. "Margaret Coleman. She was a social worker who specialized in emergency placements of traumatized children. According to her notes, Catherine had severe trauma-related amnesia. She couldn't remember anything about her life before the fire, not her real name, not her family, nothing. Victoria's hands shook as she looked at the photograph, searching for memories that remained frustratingly elusive. I remember her, Margaret. She was kind. She told me I was safe, that my new family would take care of me. Frank nodded grimly. Margaret kept detailed records because she was suspicious of the placement. The Sterling family had no previous connection to child services, no background in foster care or adoption, yet somehow they'd been approved to take you within days of the fire. Where is Margaret now? Bobby asked, though something in Frank's expression suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Died in a car accident in 1979, Frank said flatly. Single vehicle collision on a clear night, just 3 days after she told a colleague she was planning to request a review of Catherine's placement. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. Anyone who asked questions about the Thompson fire or Catherine's placement seemed to meet with unfortunate accidents. The conspiracy wasn't just about covering up the original crime, it was about eliminating anyone who might expose it. Detective Morrison, Victoria said carefully, her voice steady despite the chaos that Bobby knew must be raging in her mind. What exactly are you suggesting happened to our parents? Frank looked around the parking lot, ensuring they weren't being observed, then lowered his voice to just above a whisper. Your father, Michael Thompson, had discovered that several major construction projects in the county were being built with substandard materials. Safety inspections were being falsified, money was being skimmed, and city officials were being paid to look the other way. How much money are we talking about? Bobby asked, though he suspected the answer would be substantial enough to justify murder. Conservative estimate $50 million in today's dollars, Frank replied. But more importantly, if the fraud had been exposed, 3 major buildings would have had to be demolished and rebuilt, including the new courthouse that Judge Eleanor Sterling had championed as her legacy project. Victoria gasped, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. Eleanor, my adoptive grandmother, she was so proud of that courthouse. She used to take me there when I was young, showing me the cornerstone with her name on it. A cornerstone marking a building constructed with materials that wouldn't have met safety standards, Frank confirmed. Your father had the documentation to prove it. He was scheduled to present his evidence to the county commission the Tuesday after he died. Bobby felt the final pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. So they killed our parents to stop the testimony, then covered it up by buying the property through Sterling Development, and rescued Catherine to make themselves look like heroes, Frank added. Judge Sterling could point to her charitable adoption of a fire orphan as evidence of her good character. Who would suspect someone so compassionate of murder? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the horror of what she was learning. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, but filled with a strength that reminded Bobby of their mother. If this is all true, then my entire life has been built in a lie. Everything the Sterling family gave me, education, opportunities, wealth, it all came from blood money, from the murder of my real parents. Bobby reached out and took her hand, noting that she didn't pull away this time. Catherine, you were a child. None of what they did was your fault. But I've been living off it for 47 years, she said, tears streaming down her face. I've been the grateful daughter, the successful businesswoman carrying on the Sterling legacy. I've given speeches about Judge Eleanor's charitable spirit and community leadership, never knowing it was all built on murder and lies. Frank stepped closer, his expression filled with the determination of someone who'd waited decades for justice. Ms. Thompson, what matters now is what you do with the truth. Marcus Webb has spent his entire career covering this up, eliminating witnesses, intimidating anyone who got too close. You have the power to finally expose what really happened. And what about Marcus's warning? Bobby asked, remembering the lawyer's thinly veiled threats. He seemed to think there were other innocent people who could be hurt if this comes out. Frank's expression darkened with the cynicism of someone who'd seen too many criminals claim noble motives for their crimes. Marcus Webb is many things, but he's not particularly concerned about innocent people. If he's warning about collateral damage, it's because he has leverage information or evidence that could hurt people who aren't involved in the original crime, but who might have unknowingly benefited from it. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles caught their attention. Three black SUVs were turning into the shop's parking lot, moving with the purposeful coordination of a military operation. They weren't speeding, but there was something ominous about their synchronized arrival that made Bobby's skin crawl. "That's not good," Frank muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward his concealed weapon. "I count at least 8 people, possibly more." The lead SUV stopped just yards away, and Marcus Webb emerged from the passenger seat. But this wasn't the controlled attorney from earlier in the day. This Marcus looked desperate, dangerous, like a man who'd run out of options and was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his secrets. "Victoria," he called, his voice carrying across the lot with false warmth that didn't mask the underlying steel. "You need to come with me. Now. There are things you don't understand. Things that could get us all killed if you keep listening to these people." Frank stepped protectively in front of Bobby and Victoria, his weapon now visible but not yet raised. "That's far enough. Webb, this is still a public place, and these folks have every right to know the truth about their family." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the bitter amusement of someone who'd long ago stopped believing in concepts like justice or truth. "Public Place Detective Morrison, you of all people should know that there are no truly public places when you're dealing with the kind of money and power at stake here." "What are you talking about?" Victoria demanded, stepping around Frank despite Bobby's attempt to hold her back. Her fear was giving way to anger, and Bobby could see their mother's fierce determination beginning to emerge. Marcus's expression softened as he looked at his adopted sister, and for a moment Bobby glimpsed genuine affection beneath the lawyer's calculating exterior. "Victoria, I know you're angry. You have every right to be, but the Thompson fire was just the beginning. Over the past 47 years, the Sterling family has been part of a network that stretches from Columbus to Washington, D.C. Bobby felt his blood run cold. "You're talking about organized crime." "I'm talking about survival," Marcus corrected, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had made him a formidable courtroom opponent. "Your father's testimony wouldn't have just exposed municipal corruption in Cedar Falls. It would have unraveled relationships and arrangements that have kept Ohio's political and business infrastructure running smoothly for decades." Victoria stared at her adoptive brother with growing horror. "Are you saying our family is part of some kind of conspiracy?" "I'm saying our family has been protected by one," Marcus replied carefully. "And if you expose what happened in 1976, you'll be signing death warrants for dozens of innocent people whose only crime was being born into families that profited from mutually beneficial arrangements." Frank scoffed with the disgust of someone who'd heard every excuse criminals could devise. "That's the oldest con in the book. Webb, you can't expose the truth because it will hurt innocent people. How many witnesses have you silenced with that line over the years?" Marcus's face hardened into the expression Bobby imagined he'd worn in courtrooms when destroying hostile witnesses. "Detective Morrison, your idealism is admirable but dangerously naive. You think this is about justice? This is about a $100 billion economic network that employs thousands of people and funds dozens of legitimate charitable foundations. Would you really burn all that down for the sake of 2 people who died 47 years ago?" "Yes," Bobby said without hesitation, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone whose moral compass had never wavered. "Those 2 people were my parents. They were Catherine's parents, and she deserves to know who she really is, regardless of what it cost your network of criminals." Marcus turned to Victoria, his expression pleading in a way that seemed genuinely painful for him. "Catherine Victoria, you have to understand. My mother didn't just save you from the fire. She saved you from a life of poverty and struggle that would have limited every opportunity you ever had." He gestured toward Bobby's modest shop, his expensive suit and manicured hands emphasizing the contrast between their worlds. Look what you've become: successful, educated, influential. You're about to be appointed to the State Commerce Commission. You could do real good in that position, help shape policy that affects millions of people. Victoria's jaw tightened with an anger that transformed her refined features into something fierce and uncompromising. Built on lies and murder, built on pragmatic choices made by people who understood that sometimes the greater good requires difficult sacrifices. Marcus countered, his voice taking on the evangelical fervor of someone who'd convinced himself that evil was actually virtue. Your parents were going to destroy hundreds of lives and billions of dollars in economic activity out of misguided principle. My mother prevented that destruction. By murdering them, Bobby said flatly, his voice cutting through Marcus's rationalizations like a blade. Marcus was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his options, then nodded slowly with the resignation of someone who'd carried a secret for too long. Yes, by murdering them, the admission hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming everything that had come before it. Victoria staggered backward as if she'd been physically struck, her face draining of color as the full horror of her situation became clear. You just confessed to conspiracy in the murder of my parents, Bobby said, his phone still recording everything. In front of witnesses, Marcus smiled with the cold amusement of someone who'd long ago stopped believing in consequences. That recording will never see the inside of a courtroom. Mr. Thompson, there are too many people with too much to lose. Too many judges, prosecutors, and politicians who owe their careers to the network my family helped build. Frank drew his weapon, the movement smooth and professional despite his age. This conversation is over. Webb, you and your people need to leave, and we're going to call this in to the FBI. Marcus didn't seem particularly concerned by the gun pointed at him, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd reacted with alarm. Detective Morrison, you're a retired small-town cop with a .38 special. I have 3 vehicles full of people who make their living solving problems exactly like this situation. As if on cue, the doors of the other SUVs opened, and several men in dark suits emerged. They moved with the practiced efficiency of professional security personnel, but Bobby noticed that they kept their hands visible and made no overtly threatening gestures. They were professionals, not street thugs, which somehow made them more dangerous. However, Marcus continued, his tone becoming almost conversational, I didn't come here for a confrontation. I came to make an offer that might appeal to your sense of family responsibility. We're listening, Frank said, his weapon still trained on Marcus, but his voice indicating cautious willingness to hear what the lawyer had to say. $5 million, Marcus said, looking directly at Bobby. Cash, untraceable, deposited in offshore accounts that can't be touched by any government agency. Enough to rebuild your shop into the finest automotive facility in Ohio. Send your son to any college in the world and live comfortably for the rest of your life. Bobby didn't hesitate, despite the astronomical sum being offered. No, Marcus turned to Victoria, his expression mixing genuine affection with calculated manipulation. And for you, sister, a seat on the Sterling Foundation Board and access to $500 million in charitable funds. Think of the good you could do with that kind of resource. Scholarships for deserving students, medical research, disaster relief. You could literally save thousands of lives. Victoria looked at Bobby, then at Frank, then back at Marcus. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying the strength that Bobby remembered from their childhood. I don't want your blood money, Marcus. I want justice for my real family, and I want the truth about what happened to them. Marcus's expression hardened, and Bobby saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. Then you've both made a fatal mistake. He turned to walk back to his vehicle, but stopped when a new voice cut through the tension like a cavalry bugle announcing the arrival of reinforcements. The only mistake here was thinking you could bury the truth forever. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 60s emerging from a news van that had just pulled into the parking lot, followed by a camera crew and several people Bobby didn't recognize. The woman moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades confronting powerful people with uncomfortable questions. Sarah Chen, investigative reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. The woman introduced herself, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a career on exposing corruption. We've been monitoring police communications and followed Detective Morrison here. Marcus's face went pale as he realized that his carefully controlled situation was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. This is a private conversation between family members. Not anymore, Sarah replied with the cheerful ruthlessness that had made her one of Ohio's most feared investigative journalists. We've been investigating the Sterling family's business practices for 18 months. Your confession to the Thompson murders is exactly the piece we needed to connect 47 years of corruption, intimidation, and systematic cover-ups. One of the men who'd emerged from the news van stepped forward, showing a badge that gleamed in the afternoon light. Agent David Park, FBI. Marcus Webb Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal to Bobby, like watching a movie of someone else's life. Marcus and several of his security team were taken into custody without resistance, their professional demeanor remaining intact even as handcuffs were applied. FBI agents secured the area and began processing what was clearly a long-planned operation, not a spontaneous response to the day's events. How long have you been watching them? Bobby asked Agent Park as the immediate chaos began to settle. 18 months, Park replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally paid off. Ever since a whistleblower came forward with evidence of a corruption network involving construction contracts, judicial appointments, and political influence peddling, your family's case was the keystone that connected everything else. Sarah Chen approached Bobby and Victoria, her camera crew remaining at a respectful distance. Mr. Thompson, Miss Sterling, would you be willing to go on record about what you've discovered? Your testimony could help us expose a network that's been operating for nearly half a century. Bobby looked at his sister, really looked at her for the first time in 47 years, and saw not the polished executive who'd walked into his shop 2 days ago, but the little girl he'd loved and lost and found again. What do you think, Catherine? He asked quietly. Victoria. Catherine smiled through her tears, and for a moment Bobby saw their mother's face looking back at him. I think it's time to tell the truth. Bobby, all of it. 6 months later, Bobby Thompson stood in the gleaming lobby of the Catherine Thompson Center for Child Advocacy, watching his sister address a room full of social workers, child advocates, law enforcement officials, and journalists. The center had been built with funds recovered from the Sterling Foundation after a federal investigation had unraveled decades of corruption and fraud, exposing a network that reached from Ohio to Washington D.C. The Catherine Thompson Center exists to ensure that no child ever again disappears into a system designed to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. Catherine was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through the system's failures and emerged stronger. My brother Bobby and I lost 47 years of family because people chose profit over people. Silence over justice. In the audience, Bobby spotted Danny, now a freshman at Ohio State studying both mechanical engineering and criminal justice. The young man had adapted to the dramatic expansion of his family with remarkable grace, embracing his newfound aunt and the complex history that connected them. He'd also inherited something of his father's gift for fixing broken things, though his interests had expanded beyond automotive repair to include broken systems of justice. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of revelations, trials, and painful discoveries. Judge Eleanor Sterling had died of a stroke while in federal custody, taking many secrets to her grave, but leaving behind a paper trail that had helped prosecutors unravel decades of carefully hidden crimes. Marcus Webb Sterling had been sentenced to life in prison without parole after providing detailed testimony about the network he'd helped maintain. His cooperation motivated more by a desire to protect his adopted sister than by any genuine remorse. The Sterling development empire had been liquidated, its assets used to fund victim compensation programs and community development projects throughout Ohio. The corruption investigation had led to the resignation of 3 judges, 2 state legislators, and a congressman, while exposing construction fraud that had affected dozens of public buildings across the Midwest. Catherine had taken a new name, Catherine Thompson Sterling, honoring both her birth family and acknowledging the complex reality of her upbringing. She'd stepped down from her corporate positions but had thrown herself into philanthropic work with the fierce determination that Bobby remembered from their childhood. As Catherine concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, she caught Bobby's eye and smiled. It was the same smile he remembered from 47 years ago, bright and hopeful and full of love, but tempered now by wisdom and pain and an understanding of how fragile happiness could be. After the ceremony, as they walked together toward Bobby's rebuilt and expanded auto shop, Catherine broke the comfortable silence that had become natural between them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my Lexus hadn't broken down that day?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. Bobby considered the question, thinking about the countless small decisions and random events that had led to their reunion. "I think somehow, some way, we would have found each other. Family has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to destroy it." Catherine took his arm, a gesture that had become natural despite the decades they'd spent apart. "Besides," Bobby added with a grin that reminded her of the boy who'd once read her bedtime stories, "I've always been pretty good at fixing things that seem beyond repair." Behind them, the Catherine Thompson Center stood as a monument to the truth that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the most broken things in life, families, trust, faith in human goodness, can be rebuilt stronger than they were before. In the distance, they could see Danny working in the expanded shop, teaching mechanical skills to at-risk teenagers as part of a program Catherine had helped establish. The sight of the next generation learning honest work and finding purpose in fixing what was broken filled them both with a hope that had seemed impossible just months before. The luxury SUV and the timing chain that had needed repair had been merely the visible symptoms of something much deeper that was broken. But Bobby Thompson had always been good at diagnosing the real problems hidden beneath surface symptoms, and Catherine Sterling had always possessed the determination to see difficult projects through to completion. Together, they'd fixed the most important thing of all their family, and in doing so, had helped repair a small piece of the world's faith in truth and justice. The Thompson family was whole again, and both siblings understood that some repairs, once properly completed, would last for generations to come. 6 months after a broken timing chain changed everything, Bobby Thompson stands in the lobby of a center bearing his sister's name, not the one she was given by those who stole her, but the one she was born with, Catherine Thompson Sterling, a name that honors both the family that loved her and the painful truth of how she survived. They lost 47 years, birthdays, holidays, the simple daily moments that build a lifetime of memories. But they gained something else, the knowledge that love doesn't die, even when buried under decades of lies. That justice, however delayed, still has the power to heal. The Sterling Empire is gone, its blood money transformed into scholarships and safe havens for children who, like Catherine, might otherwise disappear into systems designed to protect the guilty rather than the innocent. The powerful men who thought their secrets were buried forever learned that some truths are too strong to stay hidden. In the end, it wasn't about the luxury SUV or the timing chain that needed repair. It was about understanding that some things, family, truth, the bonds that tie us to who we really are, can survive even the most devastating attempts to destroy them. What would you do if your entire life turned out to be built on someone else's lie?